Hey there, friends.
Friends.
Well, if it isn't my favorite neighbor. You know what? Let's get started with this. So, in the previous episode, it's like I have my own podcast now. But basically, in the previous episode, we looked at how we can create a charm using nothing but just plain old Python. Really, sorry. If you hear someone screaming, those are my kids just being rowdy. But anyway, so in the previous video, we looked at how we were able to create a charm. Very basic charm, doesn't do much. But basically we were able to create a charm using nothing but pure Python, no dependencies and everything else, right? And that's made possible by a few things that Juju provides. So let's review how we got it to work, right? Basically, when Juju executes a hook, it just calls your charm. It doesn't care what your charm looks like or what programming language it's written in, as long as it's an executable. Juju is fine with that. So from the point of view of Juju, it's just executing some executable, running some executable. And when it runs that executable, it also provides a number of environment variables. One of them being Juju dispatch path, which just contains a string that says hooks / the name of the hook, right? And so that's how we were able to make that work in the previous video. So basically, our code just called its own main function, right? Execute its main function, and then from there we get the Juju dispatch path environment variable, right? And if that doesn't exist, then we just default to unknown, right? And we put that in the variable named event name. And then in the next line of code, we just call or get the event handler that corresponds to that event name. And the event handler, which we define up here, lines 11 to line 16, basically just says if Juju is calling this hook, then use that event handler. All of them use the same event handler for now, but who cares? So we just want to demonstrate that it works. And then finally, if we find an event handler defined for that particular hook, then we just call that event handler and give it the event name as its argument, right? And that's how it works, basically. The thing that I have a problem with this, though, is the terminology, the event terminology makes it look like we're dealing with some long-running process here. Because event handlers, you typically associate that with a long-running process that responds to events in real time, handles events in real time, right? But in our case, really, once main is done executing that so-called event handler, it just exits, right? In fact, all of the hooks that Juju calls are short-lived processes, right? So hooks install, Juju will call your charm, give it the Juju dispatch path of hooks install. Right? And then when that charm is done with that, then it exits and Juju continues. In the next hook, Juju will then, in the next hook, like hook config change, for example, Juju will again call your charm, giving it this as the Juju dispatch path. And then when the charm's done, exits. And then the next hook, that's what happens again, right? So basically, the terminology that we're using here, event handlers, an event handler, event name, is a bit misleading because it makes one think that the charm is a long-running process, and I didn't really want to give that impression in my code. And apart from that, this definition over here of the event handlers is a little bit more boilerplate than I wanted to write. I wanted to be able to just define the hook and then be done with that, right? What I really want is something like this. So I just define a hook for config changed, and then I do stuff there, right? And I don't need to create an event handler dictionary where I map the hook to a function. I just want to define the hook and be done with it. And then in line 12 and 13, I just say call dispatch, which is a function that I would define somewhere else, right? So that's it. That's all that I really needed to do in my code. And I wanted to be able to correspond to the charm hooks that are defined in this documentation over here. For example, config change, right? I just want to say, you know, the hook to be executed, or the function to be executed, is hook config change, which is just really the hook name, but with a hook underscore prepended to the name, and then all hyphens converted to underscores, right? And that's what we're doing right here. Hook config changed, hook install, hook start. Those are all hooks that are defined in the Juju documentation, and you don't need to look anywhere else to find out what are the hooks that you can define in your charm, right? So let's see that in action. So right now I have this piece of code over here. I want to be able to look in my charm, and if we go to lines 35, that's our hook for config change, that's our hook for install, and that's our hook for start, right? Now, a hook for config change just logs something there. Hook for install, it just logs something and also does a JSON dump of the environment variables. Nothing much happening there. Now, hook start is where the interesting part is. We're loading the Kubernetes client credentials, which is just a helper function that we defined over here, right? And then in lines 48 of the start config, or the start hook, we just call client core v1 API, which is provided by the official Kubernetes library. That's, you know, maintained by the Kubernetes team, right? Upstream Kubernetes code right there that we just import, right? And then in line 49, we just call one of the Kubernetes client's methods, which is list pod for all namespaces, right? And then from this point onwards, we just say list all of those pods that were found. And then finally, we set the status for this charm. We just set it to active and with a comment, looking good, Billy Ray, right? And again, this is something that's provided for by the official Juju documentation, as you can find in this comment over here, right? So let's see that in action, shall we? So we're going to split this window into 4 parts. Over here, we are going to show the logs, right? And then I'm just going to set the logging to trace over there. All right, so we should see some action going on there once we deploy the charm, right? And in this quadrant over here, we're just watching Juju status, right? And over here is where we're going to deploy the charm. So we're just going to go make build, deploy, and it's deploying the charm. As you can see over here, it's initializing, right? Just transient blocking stuff there. And over here, we can see that it's, you know, it's doing its stuff, right? So it found pods and then started listing them in the logs. And then finally, we have our unit over here set to active as we expect, and then the message that says looking good, Billy Ray, right? Now you might be wondering, how was I able to import Kubernetes over here? So in my project, I just said the runtime requirements is Kubernetes, which I then feed into setup, right? And then make dependencies will then update the requirements.txt, and then requirements.txt will set all of the direct and indirect dependencies that we have. And then when we do make build, which is defined in the make file over here, make build just calls last build, and last build just does a number of things over there, which is basically, first of all, it runs setup.py build, right? And then creates the build directory, and from there it just zips that up, turns it into a charm file, basically, which is just another zip file, and that's what we deploy into Juju. So that's it. That is Unboxed Part 2. I hope you'll be able to find some interesting stuff over here. I certainly learned a lot of stuff from this part of my learning journal. And play around with it, learn Juju charms a bit deeper, and have fun. Thanks for watching.